What's going on, everyone? Before we start this week's Reef Therapy session, I just want to let everyone know that in a month, August 6th and 7th, we're going to be hosting Reefstock Australia for the first time in 3 years. Now, part of the Reef Builders team will be out there, and we cannot wait to see our Australian reefing family again. We look forward to visiting with all the manufacturers, seeing some new products, checking out all the awesome Australian corals, giving away a lot of prizes in the raffle, and hosting some great speakers for you to learn more about reef aquariums as a hobby and the industry. So make sure to go to reefstock.show for more information, and we hope to see everybody out there. Reefstock Australia, August 6th and 7th. What's going on, my brother Mark? Thanks for joining me on this makeup session of Reef Therapy. Are you feeling better?
Getting there, slowly but surely. It's going around the house now. Coronavirus, I had it, my wife's had it, now my daughter has it. So it's... I
feel a little bit left out of the club, man. So many friends I know are having it right now, and I'm still just somehow dodging that bullet. But we won't dwell on that too much. You were out here a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
And it was good to see you in person. And
yeah, man.
Took that time to just kind of reconnect and, just have our own sessions of reef therapy and talk about a bunch of stuff. What did you think, I guess, about our time?
I enjoyed it, man. It was nice because I was there last summer, and then I came back this summer, and it's sort of like, when you have a niece or a nephew that you only see in the summertime, and then you're shocked at how much they've grown just because you don't get to see them every day. And, so for me, seeing your systems, obviously they'd been up longer than just last year, but just seeing the change from last year to this year was really cool. And seeing how just everything is just grown in on an epic scale on every tank was fun to just walk around, and take it all in.
Last year we did some work. We did like almost 2-3 hours of video touring, and then a reef therapy session, and then a reef session, private session right after that. But this time I felt like it was nice to just kind of, just be present together, and then talk about it now. And it's nice to have someone like you who has like a mental, personal snapshot of the tanks, and you can see them year over year. Where I'm just like looking at a tank like, oh God, I wish this coral was bigger. I wish this coral was bigger. And then for months. And then finally I'll look at the tank like, oh, that coral needs to be fragged. That coral needs to be cut down. That is actually one of the challenges, man. I've been trying to keep every kind of coral. And I'm starting to realize that some of them aren't worth it. Like I babysat some kind of, it was a Pasipora meandrina, so kind of semi-thick branching, and it was one of the first colonies here in the studio, and it didn't really grow. It was surrounded by Pasiporas that were growing, and I would clean it up and then cut it down, and then clean it up and cut it down, and then finally I aborted it, and like it was like breaking up with a needy girlfriend or something. I'm like, oh my God, thank goodness. Like, I wish you would have worked out, but you didn't. And I've done that with a handful of different corals, like these like just random, very thin bottle brush brown acros. I've given away a bunch, but just the other day after you visited, I chucked a bunch of stuff. I was like, man, this is not, I'm the only one who would be interested in this coral, so there's not even a point in trying to give it away or trying to sell it or take it to the fish store, because I've already done that. I actually filled up a couple buckets of C grade coral, because I'm down with the B grade coral. But the C grade stuff, I was like, all right, you guys flunked. You're bad. You go bye-bye.
Yeah.
None of these are LPS, right? They're mostly SBS colonies that I have like lots of other samples of, so I can regrow them again.
Yeah, the closest I can relate to that, because you obviously have so many more systems and so much more room for coral, and you have so many different types of systems. But the closest I can relate is just when you start to make compromises around one coral in your tank, and everything is, every decision is tiered off of, there's this big coral here. And that's what happened with my leather, where it had grown so massive, and it was so fun to have a massive leather coral as a showpiece. But every decision, like the aquascaping was based around that coral, and eventually you're like, you know what, dude, it's time to rehome you because I'm making too many compromises for one coral, and it's keeping me from doing other things I really want to do, right? So,
I love leather corals, man, but they just so demanding. It's there's a group of corals that like if you grow the heck out of it, it's like it's awesome, right? But take the case of a leather coral. Either it's not doing well and just kind of taking up space, or it's doing really well and taking up a ton of space.
yeah.
And God, I swear, like a lot of different leather coral strains are just way more fun when they're small and cute.
Yeah.
When they're 1 to 2 to maybe 4 inches, and then when it's like 6, 7, 8, 12 inches, they're like, all right, this is not fun anymore. You're fundamentally affecting the flow around the aquarium. Detritus is building up at the base of your stalk or whatever, and I'm having to kind of cull a little bit. At first, I managed that here at the studio by setting up another tank. That way I could put more corals into it.
Yeah.
But now I'm realizing, like, I have 2 different strains of brown branching bubble coral, 2 different strains of green branching bubble coral. I'm like, I don't need any more. Let me work on these strains and really get them happy. And so I'm feeling the same way about a kind of a range of different varieties that I have. A lot of different brown, gray, mauve branching varieties, and I've been hoping they would do something, for a long time, and some of them just haven't. When I had all the room and I first set up the studio, it was cute to pick up bolder varieties, big, just balls of varieties. It's super common out in the ocean. And now there's been a few years and I have to navigate the flow and light and coral placement around it. I'm like, man, you guys are kind of a liability now. Just an outsized impact on the tank and not as much enjoyment from the coral itself.
Yeah. No, I can definitely relate to that on a smaller scale. But yeah, you have to, especially if you only have 1 or 2 tanks, you have to be selective, and I think you have to be a bit cold-hearted at times, and if you don't want a fruit stand of tiny little frags of every little coral, that's the opposite end of the extreme. But you also don't want to get to a point where, and this happens to me a lot because I have a lot of old corals that have been around with me for a long time, and I keep them for sentimental reasons. But sometimes you gotta let go,
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you start to get bored with your tank, you might be bored because you're growing stuff that you've been growing for 3 years, and as mature and beautiful as some of that stuff is, sometimes it's a reset or a reboot and bring in some new corals that you've had your eyes on, and now you're excited about ensuring their success, right? You're back in the game to try to get something to grow. It's a good thing.
Yeah. One thing I am realizing about the studio is I'm going to have to start applying more of an aquascaper mindset to some of these aquariums, actually, to probably all the aquariums, where an aquascaper sets out to accomplish a particular aquascape and a particular layout.
Yeah.
And kind of similarly to, our ingrained mindset of like the war on nutrients, right? It's just how we're brought up, as reefing children, to just nitrates are bad, phosphates are bad. Let's just get rid of do everything you can to just knock those back, and that, is never going to go away. But same thing with the reef tank. There's not really as much discussion about, because corals theoretically grow slowly, right? We have it in our mind that you're going to put some of these corals in place and you're going to enjoy them like that for like 5 to 10 years if you keep the reef tank that long. But any moderately successful reefer knows that 2 to 3 years, of really ideal growth, you got to do some work, and if you don't, even like, say, we're not talking about junky corals, we're talking about great looking corals, your, or a red planet might overgrow your Oregon tort and just really disproportionately affect the tank. Like Chris Cap's 8-foot tank, he's got a 3-foot Jedi mind trick. It's a good 3 by 2 feet, and he is constantly cutting colony-sized chunks off of it. There's nothing he can't do. He can't really take that coral out. I've been trying to put it in his ear to turn it into the aquascape, like start putting clams like just right on top of it.
Oh, yeah.
and making some little clearings and just putting acros right on top of it, because it needs to be slowed down somehow. So yeah, there's not enough conversation about like reaching a desired aquascape. I know this might kind of be alien speak to some folks who are newer in the hobby or who have maybe not grown corals as much or as long. But yeah, we really need to consider a little bit more. Like I have a perfect patch of 3 different torch corals on one side of the flagship tank. It's a peninsula tank. They look amazing, but I'm looking at them like, you guys are crowding each other. You're crowding each other. I could literally take them all out, cut them down to about a third and put a third back, and then those polyps would reopen to fill the space that the colony currently occupies. And that's God, it's such a weird, nuanced side of the hobby to talk about.
Yeah, I actually got to see the Chris Cap tank finally. I stopped by. I got the shirt on.
Such a cool shirt.
Yeah. His wife Nicole was kind enough to give me this shirt. Thank you again, Nicole. My wife's name is Nicole too, so I think Nicole's are pretty cool. I did not get to see Chris. He was out working. So, but if he's listening, maybe I'll catch him on the next trip. But yeah, that thing is huge. It's always interesting because I brought my family along, and I always love seeing what. I don't want to call my family non-reef keepers because they've lived with me so long that they're at least 10% reef keepers, but my son immediately walked in there and was like, "Oh, Dad, they got a lot of bubble corals," and so how many 7-year-olds know what a bubble coral is? So, but in a general sense, what I mean is it's always fun to bring my family of somewhat non-reef keepers and see what they find interesting or what they notice, and that Jedi Montipora, they were all like, whoa, so just because of the sheer size of that thing.
Speaking of Montiporas or Montiporas, as you prefer, the hobby is, super focused on probably like the branching and some of the plating, but the so-called species that are encrusting, they're not only encrusting, right? I think I've talked about this before, but certain species like Undata and Confusa just look so amazing in the books, the identification books, and you can see the big colonies and you'll see like those branches come out. But like I have a Confusa now that's just, cracking about a foot in diameter, just starting to throw up branches, but it's like already too big for that aquascape. I'd love to grow a Montipora Confusa that was 18 inches in diameter and, a foot tall with this super thick, scraggly branches. And I just, God, that's a lot to trade off. I could have like probably 3 or 4 smaller colonies of acros in that spot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. There is some value in bonsaiing these corals, right? I mean, seeing that Jedi as big as it is and knowing it's still relatively small compared to what you may see scuba diving, for example, is a real eye opener. We talked about everyone should go snorkel or scuba dive in previous talks just because it really opens up your mind. But yeah, just seeing like a lobophytum that's as big as my desk, it makes you realize like you could literally have a 6-foot tank with just lobophytum, and it'd be kind of cool, but it'd also probably be boring after a while. So yeah,
and I guess this conversation could probably just be titled "The Drawbacks of Success."
Yeah.
So one perfect example right now that I'm facing is my mangrove trees. First of all, I had them for about a year and they just kind of barely grew. And then about last year, I put an automatic mister on them, and they were like the typical small 2 to 4, maybe 4 to 8 leaved little mangroves that, most people can get up to. And then when I put the mister on, they just exploded in growth. Well, I just realized, recently that the trees started dropping a little bit more leaves than usual. When the new leaves open up, they have these small kind of protector leaves that always fall down, but then they only lose large, older leaves when they're not getting misted enough. So I'm looking at the tank, I'm like, man, we're starting to get some holes in this foliage. What's going on? And I hadn't realized, because this is kind of a new thing to me, The pre-filter that I was using before the booster pump that feeds the misters from the freshwater tank, it had started, the pre-filter itself had started decomposing, just
Ew.
like falling apart. And I hadn't even thought of this, and I didn't realize that the mister, I could hear it going, and I just assumed it was going, but it wasn't until like I sat there and turned it on, I was like, wait, this is not normal. So I pulled out the pre-filter, and it was just disintegrated as soon as I pulled it off and shook it a little bit. It's like paper pleated stuff. So I'm gonna have to have it in mind to. I already have some more on order, but I need to replace those, twice a year at least. But on the other side, like the trees have grown out of the tank. They're hitting the sides of the walls, out of water, and the mister. Even when I got it back up and running properly, it doesn't miss the entire tree, and I'm like, oh crap, I can't. What am I supposed to do? Just keep growing the enclosure or building the enclosure bigger and bigger so I can mist it more and more? And like, am I going to grow an actual freaking tree? And I'm like, all right. I'd like to pull those mangroves out and put them in a really more dedicated mangrove setup, and then start over with some new mangrove pods, and then learn how to bonsai them, right? Because now that I know how quickly they get big, I feel a lot more confident in being aggressive and trimming the tops to try to get thicker, bushier branches. Although, as you pointed out, the trees I have right now have some really cool roots.
Yeah.
Have some really, really cool roots. So,
You're getting to the point where the roots could be the aquascape, eventually. Yeah. And I mean, that would be always a dream tank of mine, where you've seen some of those public aquariums where they make fake mangrove roots out of resin. And then, to have something like that and then put corals on them, but have it actually be mangrove roots, it would take such a long time to get there. But man, that would be a cool tank,
So we just did a video on that whole wall.
Yeah. And
because I did kind of a late spring cleaning of the sump and in every tank, not just like a token wipe down some detritus removal, but just something a little deeper, just getting at all the sponges that build up for us, spots of where the Valonia builds up that the emerald crabs can't get to, and just really reconsidering all the corals that were in each tank. And then when we got to the mangrove tank, it wasn't until we were in the middle of shooting the video, because the bottom part of the mangrove tank has been a kind of a gallery where we've cycled different types of corals in there, including the leather corals that I've talked about that have just gotten way too big. And it wasn't until during the shooting I'm like, oh my God, this might be a perfect place to keep one or two of my showy anemones, because then they can just walk around the roots. I just have to figure out, a really bulletproof way to isolate them from the two Neros that are in there. But man, if I could get like the Retteri or the Magnifica on one side and then the blue carpet on the other, ooh, that would be crazy. And if I'm really dreaming, I'm figure out how to get the pizza, the rainbow pizza anemone, like kind of in front, in the center. Oh my God, that would be freaking crazy. And then, but then the fish aquascape in there, or the fish population would be token clownfish. But I've always wanted to do that. I think that'd be really cool, and a really good blend to have this unique lagoonal aquarium with bonsai mangrove trees, and then like 2 or 3 show clownfish anemones, and then find all the anemone crabs and anemone shrimp and other things that will go in them. I think that could be cool.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, starting to go into it with an aquascape mindset, and it got me thinking about just some of my tribulations of at least with the last 2 tanks that I've set up, my 2 current ones, what I have as a vision in my head and what I end up executing either doesn't add up or hasn't added up the way I'd hoped, or in the end, I discover something I didn't like about it. So, my upstairs tank, I joked about how it still looks like a pretty young tank after a year, because I reset it a couple of times that year, because I had my unhappiness with the NSA Aquascape and, certain other things that, and then I took that big leather coral out, which then made me have to reshuffle the whole aquarium because a quarter of my tank just opened up. And I finally got to a place where now I'm happy with everything and I just want to let it grow. But the tank in my basement, the vision I had in my head and what I ended up building don't sync up, and I've been very unhappy with the outcome. And then I went and visited you and family in Colorado for a week, and I've had I mean, to keep the long story short, I've always been of the opinion that cyano is not enough nutrients, so it's gets the chance to exist because the more complex algae, and cyano is not an algae, I get that, but the more complex algae aren't able to etch out a living, right? So you don't have a lot of turf algae and stuff, and so all of a sudden cyano's like, hey, I don't care that there's no nitrates because I'm a nitrogen fixer. But then you got this other camp that says, oh, no, if you got cyano, you have a buildup of gunk and you need to dose bacteria. So out of curiosity, before I left, I started dosing bacteria. I started doing the devil's advocate to myself, and I came back and the whole thing was just coated in cyano. I mean, what was just a patch was like I was purposely trying to grow cyano. So that anecdotally makes me think that my viewpoint and I'm not the only one that thinks this way, right? There's a whole slew of people that believe this, that it's more that you probably should be adding nutrients to combat cyano. But anyway, that became the impetus of like, well, I'm not really happy with this tank to begin with. It's a bit of a hot mess and not what I had envisioned, which was just like a look down lagoon. So I'm gonna go in there and retry, and maybe just like my upstairs tank, like third time's the charm. I'll get it to a place where I'm happy. But it's just interesting. Sometimes you have this grand vision. You see stuff online or you see a picture in a book, and you're like, I could do this, I could do that, and then you go execute it, and then it doesn't always pan out. Sometimes you end up with a happy accident, right? Like sometimes you end up in a place that you're like, oh, well, that's kind of cool, but I don't know. I just an interesting comment because when you said about aquascaping mindset, and then you start talking about the mangrove tank and adding the anemones, which I think will look amazing. I also think it's the other part of success sometimes is that what you end up with is like, this is not really what I was going for.
You have to like. You're not aiming for a bullseye. You're aiming just for the whole dartboard, and you're hoping to land somewhere in the neighborhood. Yeah. Right. So in my mind, like I could have the blue carpet on one side and the Ritterei on the other side, and they would never move, and they'd just be big and just get get like right up to each other and touching, and that's all you would see is just blue beads on one side and green tipped purple tentacles on the other. But that aquascape is going to have to, somehow always guide them. And then, bonsaiing the trees, like I think I have the courage now to be a little bit more aggressive about trimming branches because I see how fast the trees can grow. Yeah. But when I was talking about the aquascaping mindset, it was less about literally aquascaping the tank and using, the golden rule and golden ratios or whatever. More about like, aiming for a goal and realizing when you're at that goal. Yeah. And then start to trim and curate, not just let stuff grow rampant. I think all of us as reefers, we're just naturally trained to just let the coral grow, especially when it's growing really, really well. And you never want to interrupt that, but we have to, when you reach a certain level of, I don't know what success, but like proficiency at growing the corals, you got to trust yourself to be able to to cut them down and that they will regrow. Like the actual grafting experiment I did not too long ago, I guess it's been a year now. That coral looks amazing now. It was so tall and had a big old trunk, and I didn't like it, so I cut it down to the part that was really growing well, and that coral grew really awesome. Every branch, grew straight, and then every one of those branches started branching more, and so now it's a nice little bushy, yellow tip stag. So that's what I was meaning. I mean,
I get you on that because I mean, it's more that you have an end goal and you're disciplined enough to stick to it, and also make the sort of the sacrifice of cutting a coral back when you need to preserve that goal, right? The problem is, even the most patient person in the world is going to struggle with that, right? I mean, like my tank, I wanted a look-down LPS tank with a bunch of Gonioporas, covering the sand bed, right? Well, I bought a bunch of Goniopora frags, and they're all cute as a button, But it's probably going to take a couple of years for them to be, softball size and really, become something beautiful to behold from the top down. Now you just see like little frags on a sand bed, right? And so maybe it's okay to have, hey, I'm going to go with this intermediate look that's attractive, right? And then, planted guys do this, right? They put the fast growing plants in to get something going, and then but the end goal is to rip out those fast growing plants when the slow growing plants get sizable.
Yep.
So that's where my brain's been at, where the execution didn't fulfill the vision, and it probably will if I just hang out for 5 years. But I was thinking, maybe I enjoy the tank now in a form, and then as those goniopores get bigger, I start to pull stuff out, and I achieve that, almost like a tide pool of LPS that I was hoping for, So, but I get what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, so I've been working on the Cade aquarium that has a lot of LPS, and I have this perfect rock of orange Acanthostria echinata with bright green mouths, just a really nice piece, and I had a perfect place for it in the Cade tank, and I put it in there, and it looked amazing. It looked really great, and I was like, the best case scenario for this is that this coral takes off, takes over, and just starts killing stuff. That's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is that some coral falls into it or falls down. It's been challenging keeping corals really attached on a vertical surface. Even after a year or two, the emerald crabs can run around and just kind of pick at the wrong thing and knock it over. And that's been kind of a challenge. Especially, I've tried to do the epoxy super glue method to get like a really good bond, and that can last a long time, but just never know when something's going to come across and bump it. And this is even more of a problem in tanks with lots of hermit crabs and snails and other things. But yeah, I was looking at this Acanthostria. I was like, man, you look amazing right there. And this is the perfect tank for you. And this is too perfect for you. It's too good. Like there's, too many other LPS, Cinerinas, Endophilias, Scalemias in that tank. And I'm like, on a long timeline, you don't fit this aquarium. So I'm going to have to pull you out and earmark you for another aquarium where it'd be less of a concern. But yeah, it's hard to have that conversation about sacrificing a little bit of the coral for the benefit of the entire reef tank. So in the coral flats, again, I'm still like got this little mindset in the back of my head of, trying to get corals. I'm like, all right, it's been almost 4 years now. I got enough corals. But a lot of the weirdos just haven't necessarily panned out. And, when there's just too much coral, like the flow can't get around it, and detritus will build up in a corner. And I'm thinking about that with the fish too. I have so many yellow tangs, and I thought I was going to put a bunch of them into the new acro system, the 400-gallon display. And then I'm thinking, I was just imagining that many tangs just pooping all the time. Like, man, that'd be a lot to manage. So maybe this is going to be a very low fish load on this 400-gallon tank. And instead of having, a real show school of yellow tangs like I'd originally planned, it's like, oh, maybe I just do a much fewer of the herbivores. And, maybe focus a little bit more on the smaller fish that can just get in the slipstream of the corals and eat coral food and just have tiny little poops that the corals will eat as well. Because I don't want to compromise that 400-gallon tank.
Yeah, that'll be a fun journey to witness on the sidelines with that tank, because I think you have some really creative ideas around it. And I think it'll be a memorable tank, one that... you and I know this. There's tanks that have existed in our timeline of the hobby that became notorious in a good way. Something that becomes memorable that people still bring up from time to time. And I feel like you're on that path with that tank, just because you're not just setting up a tank that size like everybody else has and sticking corals in it, and end goal you have corals and fish and blah blah blah. Like, you have some interesting ideas around it that I think will pan out.
It's so hard. I could have that tank filled right now, but I'm just You know, you were
Discipline,
here.
man. Yeah, that's crazy.
Oh my God. Yeah, the discipline is tough. You were here and we put two more corals in there. So I started with the blue lightning stag and cycling the tank with like nice high end acro colonies, not little frags. So the blue lightning was kind of just the starter piece, and he started encrusting on the bottom. The hoaxamite that we put in there looks amazing, looks great. What else? Oh, and then the kind of the rainbow tip skinny stag. That thing looks just perfect. Everything looks perfect where we put it. But the only thing is, I'm just really trying to skate from one side to the other so I don't just have 2,000 watts of light on the tank that's only got 3 or 4 corals on the end, right? So I'm just trying to just light up that end first really thoroughly and then just go, section by section by section. So I'm hoping to have the corals I want in there by the end of the year. And so, the hoaxamite and the rainbow tip skinny, that was kind of a big step because we tripled the number of corals in the 400-gallon aquarium. But yeah, I have all the corals that I know I want to put in there. I'm trying to build it from one side to the other with the right strains and just really kind of get a nice gradient from staghorns to torch to tables, and then all the pillow-shaped acros on the left side. That's going to be easy. Towards when I get to the end, it'll be a downhill from there. But I think, setting up a 400-gallon tank, no fish, no rock. It's got 3 acros in it, colonies, 3 acro colonies. It's already doing pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, you've been talking about dosing phosphates a lot. And one interesting point that I was reading about is with everybody starting with dead rock these days, dead rock is a fantastic binder of phosphates. And you hear a lot of people dosing phosphates early on, and they keep bottoming out because their rock hasn't fully saturated. And then once their rocks are saturated, then all of a sudden they see their phosphates start to go up. And so I'm curious because you have noticed such a benefit in dosing phosphates in your systems, and here's this new system with a lot of this new calcium carbonate dead rock, which in a way is an absorption media for phosphate until it hits a critical threshold, right? Yeah, I'm kind of curious to see how that goes for you. And are you dosing phosphate into that system already, or?
I have.
Okay.
I have. And it's been, it was after we added those 2 corals that got a little bit of a real diatom bloom. Not like when you were there, it's just tiny little specks here and there. It's hard to even call it diatoms, but not a nasty, but like a legitimate little bloom of brown kind of happened on the bottom and the rocks in the back. And so, I'm going to be going to Australia here for most of August. So I'm just going to let the tank coast as it is. But I've dosed once, but that kind of brings up a good point about the nitrate and phosphate levels. And trace elements. Mm-hmm. Everybody's so obsessed with hitting the numbers, but I feel like if I dose a value of phosphate, right? So if I know I dosed enough phosphate to reach, let's say, 0.02 ppm, and by the end of the day it's at 0. Those corals, they absorb that phosphate. It's not like they don't have phosphate. So writing 0 is not bad, right? Those corals, they've eaten their fill of phosphate, right. So you don't necessarily need to keep it there. And I feel similarly about some of the trace elements. Say you dose some iron, some iodine, and you have a real high density of corals, and hypothetically you test it with a test kit that would work. At the end of the day, we know iron and iodine are really tough. If it's 0 at the end of the day, your corals still absorbed it, right? So I dose trace elements. I just assume they're going to be 0 very soon, so when I send tests off to ICP, I'm not alarmed when zinc or copper or manganese are all bottomed out. I know that I'm adding it. I know the corals are getting it. So there's more risk in trying to hit those numbers than just knowing you're actually giving them that.
Yeah, it's the clean plate club, right? If you base a decision on somebody's starving because their plate's empty, when you keep adding food to the plate, it's the wrong way to look at it, right?
Where'd you come up with that analogy?
I was just sitting here thinking about it, trying to say, well, I need to get to a point where there's always food left on the plate may not be the right course of action.
That's so funny because I've always used the analogy of someone who's dying of thirst in the desert. You know, that first glass of water, they're just going to chug it down. It's going to be great. That second glass, they might just hold on to it. They're not necessarily going to drink it right now, right? So maybe there's a conversation or discussion to be had about adding a certain amount of nutrients throughout the week or the month or whatever, and still writing zero. Right? Because if your corals are absorbing it, but then it's still technically zero nitrate, zero phosphates in the water, but you know you're adding a reasonable amount, that's kind of more like how the reef is, right? There is no measurable phosphate or nitrate on most coral reefs. And that's the whole idea between coral reefs and the biodiversity, is having all those nutrients tightly cycled, right? So as soon as they become available, they're absorbed by something else yet again. So I think, for the long term, I think for more successful reef tanks, having God, it's hard to ask somebody to put phosphate and nitrate on a doser, right? But perhaps you could dilute those down into the same solution. So you have one channel and just dose just enough to know that you're adding it, but you know that when you test it, it's still going to be zero. So you can have the benefit of adding phosphorus and nitrogen to the tank without having this reservoir of nutrients to feed, detrimental algae.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the new prevalence of people struggling with dinos. Sort of came into being over the last few years, where it used to be, oh, you got dinos, just black out your tank for a few days, and they behave more like diatoms, right? It was a brief little blip in your early startup of your tank, and you get through it. But then you have people with persistent dinos, and I do wonder if all of this dead, dry calcium carbonate rock acting as a phosphate binder early on until things kind of get built up is a facilitator to all these people having issues with dinos these days. So I agree with you on the clean plate club, right? I think as long as you're dosing something to make it bioavailable for your corals, maybe not chase a number on a test kit, but I also do worry in early tanks, if you're bottomed out, you might you might be waiting to get that buildup of where the rock isn't competing with the coral for that phosphate, right? Because the rock kind of bind it a lot quicker, right? I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
Along those same lines, I know everybody's who wants sand is gonna add sand, but I've yet to encounter someone who sees the benefit of like waiting a few months to add the sand, right? So the sand bed itself is a giant, even higher surface area.
Oh yeah.
Basically chemical media for your aquarium, sucking out all the nutrients, but then it's trapping those nutrients, especially in the form of detritus, from your fish and your corals and whatever you have. But it reaches a tipping point, depending on your nutrient input, like say 3, 6, 9 months in, where all of a sudden it can't absorb anymore, and it's just now it's starting to not suck up the nutrients, but also the built up detritus is starting to leach nutrients. So I still think there's a great conversation to be had to adding sand a few months later. I think people who set up new tanks would have just so much more success just in that nutrient and uglies journey if they just waited to add the sand. And I see these setups all the time. And I remember working the reef shops where you sell somebody a new tank, and you might be able to ring them up for $50, $100, $200 worth of just sand. And it's a high profit thing for the reef store, right? So no reef store is going to try to make the case that you shouldn't start with sand, right? So maybe enjoy the benefits of a bare bottom to begin with, especially since people are cycling their tanks with fish instead of corals and just kind of basic reef life at the very time when your tank is trying to learn and develop to process that. So I think along the lines of what you're saying, as far as like this dry rock being a sponge initially, but then it stops after a while. I think, people who want sand in a proper display would see a lot of benefits. Just wait 2-3 months, maybe up to 6 months when your tank is really, really rocking, and then just add it slowly. But that's, you see these new setups where there's like 3-4 inches of sand on day one. I'm like, all right, good luck with that. I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah. I think the people who I love sand, but I think the people who praise deep sand beds and have much success with them, usually, if you look at the photos, those are examples of tanks with a lot of coral biomass, right? And that coral biomass is consuming a lot of that sand bed leaching nutrients. It's almost you could argue it's almost beneficial at that point that, instead of dosing, your deep sand bed is dosing your tank with nutrients for your corals, right? But deep sand bed in a tank with very little coral biomass and very new is a tricky path to go on. I would say. I'm not saying it can't be done, but man, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I mean, I'm more of have a little bit of a shallow sand substrate that's attractive, and then when you do get in for some water changes, that's the other thing. People always say vacuum a quarter of your sand bed because you don't want your system to crash or something bad to happen. I'm like, screw that, man. I do the whole substrate like it's a freshwater tank with an under gravel filter, man. I'm in there with like worse. A freaking
I do it even worse on the nano tank. We've started applying what we do to the UNS aquarium as far as like doing large water changes. So that if you don't recall or haven't heard before, we have this one tank here at the studio. It's about 20 gallons. It's got one large fox coral, one large elegance, a plate coral on the bottom, and then just a turbinaria on the back. And instead of dosing or testing or anything, we just drain it all down, exchange it with the system water that we know is good, rich reef chemistry. And what's funny is if we generally do this about once a week, if we go 2 weeks, I notice that the corals start to pale out just a little bit. And so what they're missing is nutrients. Yeah. Right? Because we don't dose nutrients to that small little tank. So we started to apply that to the Red Sea Nano at the front. I thought about it. It's like, man, we could set up all kinds of dosers and tests and this and that. I'm like, or we could just do this other method where we just drain a significant amount of water and refill it with system water. But when the sand bed is dirty, sometimes we do use the gravel siphon. Other times I just straight take a hose, suck out the part I want, take it over to the sink, hose it down with the spray, and then put it back in the tank. Yeah. Right. So I literally will wash it with fresh tap water, and it's not a big deal. All the real action is going inside is in the pores of the media. And I've always thought about this, like people are so worried with cleaning their biomedia with the tank water that's at a proper temperature. I'm like, if osmotic imbalance really had such an effect on microbial and bacterial population, we would wash our hands with salt water. Right? If it was such a big thing, but it's not. So my freshwater tank biomedia, I'll hose it down in the sink, not too aggressively. There is a point at which you can start to blast off some of that biofilm. And same thing with my saltwater biomedia. I have no problems just kind of hosing it down with fresh water, not letting it soak, because there might be like sponge and other myofauna that is a little bit larger. It's not going to appreciate that. But yeah, we get pretty aggressive with our gravel cleaning in the Red Sea Nano.
Yeah, I had to laugh. Not quite bacteria, but a similar note. Somebody on Facebook posted this funny meme where, aquarists are like, we must drip acclimate our fish to match the pH and the temperature and everything perfectly. And then it's like, meanwhile in Utah, and it shows one of those planes that's just spitting out trout into mountain lakes, like with a tube, and it looks like it's like a gun firing trout. And I'm not saying that those trout are in for a shock, and maybe some of them, die from the stress of it all. But it's just funny, yeah, the way that it's like you always talk about. It's like the sand bed becomes something we have to take care of, and oh, don't disturb the sand bed. And to me, it's
Or the
just
algae scrubber.
decoration. It does add some good microbial life, I think sometimes, but I don't know. I've been on a crushed coral kick, man. I tried some small millimeter sand again in this tank, and that's another thing that just didn't pan out. I'm like, nope, I'm gonna go do some reborn media like I did in my upstairs tank. I wish I could find the big reborn still somehow. But the new stuff's fine too. But it's like I more look at it like, oh, I have a lot of little live rocks, on the base of my tank, and copepods are gonna run around in there and eat crap, and coralline algae is gonna coat it, and then every once in a while I go in there with a gravel siphon and get all the detrital gunk out, and the whole sugar sand, like, or even special grades, too small for me now. I don't like that stuff anymore. Maybe I'll change my mind at some point, but
I would totally put Reborn in the 400-gallon tank if I didn't have the closed loop mounted on the bottom. If the closed loop was somehow mounted on the back,
yeah,
and it wasn't sucking in from the bottom, I would totally be on track to make a Reborn gravel bottom. I actually have enough of it to do something like that, because I found it in the back corners of like some dusty old aquarium shops. I swear I bought 2 bags that were green because they'd been moist for so long and just enough light that algae was growing inside of them. But I'll never use them for calcium reactor media.
No,
they make such good rubble. That might be a good thing to use in the mangrove anemone display to help keep the anemones in place a little bit. I was going to say something else.
Yeah, you were the first I ever saw do that. It was at a fish store aquarium. Yeah, long ago.
Yeah, there's actually videos. There's a couple videos. If you go to YouTube and Aquamar Reef display, there's a couple videos there of kind of a classic metal halide lit aquarium with dumb Vortec pumps. Before they had any wireless ability, they were just a knob to turn them up and down, and then true adductors on the returns. So yeah, that was a pretty fun tank. It was really cool because you didn't realize just how many tips break off the corals just through the action of the fish. And then when they have a stable substrate to just kind of land in, they would just encrust into little spats everywhere they landed on the bottom. And I remember a really cool fish for that tank that you wouldn't think you'd find around high flow was dragonface pipefish. They loved that tank, man. They'd just be all over the place and just act like they were really made for it. And the only thing, I've only seen dragonface pipefish, I've seen them in the wild plenty, and they're not like in that kind of flow zone, but they're usually like in the wave zone, so it's a different kind of water flow. Man, they are some of the boldest fish. You can like get real close to them. I've had them about 4 or 5 inches from my mask. I'm just sitting there staring at them, watching them just kind of go around, and they're just somehow don't care that there's this 6-foot creature floating above them while I'm snorkeling. It's kind of impressive.
I've never kept them. That's another fish that I've just, never entered my aquarium. I should add that to my list.
Very cool fish. Very, very lots of personality. I don't, I'm sure you could train them, but that is one of the fish, like a classic mandarin. You just need an established reef, with substrate and lots of rock for them to pick their nose through, and they do really, really well. But they won't eat, red bugs like people think. They might eat 1 or 2 there, but,
Yeah.
So, that's where I'm at right now. It's weird, like, how different the tanks look since you came by. I did a huge scrub down on the main aquapora flat, and it's like, over years, you don't realize. I mean, I know not too many people have a shuffling tank like that, but I would be putting, lower light corals in the corners or shuffling things here and there and everywhere. And it wasn't until we did like a full scrub down at the bottom, I'm like, oh, we need to get stuff off the sides and out of the corners. So it took like a tank full of euphyllia's worth of coral out of my main aquaporous system that was just shoved into the corner and growing into itself. That's all in the sump of the fat cube now. So now I have just a sump full of euphylia. There's this, oh my God, I feel so bad about this. I have this one strain of hammer coral that will go half green and half kind of gray. And almost always it's really consistent where any 5 or 6 polyps are going to be, half green and half gray, and some of the polyps are half and half. I just happen to have this one piece that is a large colony and it's gray. There is no redeemable color about that thing. If you squint real closely, you can see a little bit of green stripe at the mouth, but who's going to want that? Nobody's going to want that. A store would be mad at me for bringing it in because they don't want to sit on literally gray, solid brown Euphilia ancora. And I'm like, man, this kind of sucks. I feel like if I grew each one of those polyps out into their own colonies, the green would reappear. Because it does that. Some of the grays do appear some green. But right now, it's just a liability. It's a huge kind of gray hammer coral. I'm like, man, this sucks. What am I supposed to do? If corals are so precious, and I guess that's kind of the aquascaper mindset I was trying to think of. Like, these aquascapers, they're throwing away so many freaking plants. They always want to start off with just tissue culture, something really predictable. And you don't really, unless it's, like Bucephalandra or some fancy areocolon or some fancy stem plants, you don't see the local clubs, someone offering like really good clippings of plants, right? It's usually just giant clumps of Java moss, Anubias, and Java fern. And so same thing with the corals. It's like, I know corals are precious, but the other corals I have are more precious. So I got to make some of those sacrifices. Every time that we frag corals, I throw away perfectly good frags in the trash can. I know some people are screaming at me right now in the comments or whatever, but it's while I'm making, say, 11, I want to make 10 frags. I'll actually cut 12 frags and I'll keep the best 10. And I always pitch a couple kind of as a sacrifice just to remind myself that if I save every little piece of coral and I wait around to find a home for it or take it to somebody, it's going to negatively affect the rest of the aquarium. Right? Yeah. I can't have a giant, I would have a single rack of purple digi, a single rack of orange digi, a single rack of all these different bird's nest strain. And it's just like, I can't.
But I mean, I know you gave me crap when I set up.
Threw away a big colony of fox flame. That's a little bit different.
But at the end of the day, I mean, because I see this all the time where somebody upgrades their tank and then they move all their old mature colonies into the tank, and then you try to get it all to fit, and it doesn't fit, right? Because they're all these giant colonies, and then you're making compromises on your aquascape and on how you want the tank to look, because you're more concerned making sure that all these big colonies are happy. But then you're looking at your tank, you're like, well, this is not what I wanted. And I mean, there have been people on forums and stuff, and I've posted on them and said, hey man, my advice, hack it back and reset, and start with frags and grow it out.
It's a hard mindset to do, right? As coral aficionados, we're all collectors, right? We want to save every piece and have a piece of all different kinds of corals. And it's just hard to know when a coral has passed that threshold of being less of a fun coral to keep and more of a liability for the rest of your tank. And so that's one of the things I'm kind of coming to grips with now. I've thrown away a bunch of corals. I just want everybody to know, these are junky corals, and I give away a lot.
You're not throwing away trackies,
No. But a big old grove of candy corals, and a few of them are stung up on the side because they grew so big they're touching the next coral. I'm like, all right, I can't afford the space, the mental bandwidth to baby those pieces back to health when the other pieces are so healthy that they will recoup those losses. I don't know. I don't think it's a topic that's talked about enough. I don't know how much this is going to land with the listeners right now, but when you reach a certain level of success, also having a giant population of corals in your aquarium, what are you going to do? Just keep turning up your calcium reactor? Just keep dosing more and dosing more and dosing more?
Yeah.
Or you could keep the same number of corals and then just hack the mass down to by half. Milka style is a great example. I love Milka Stylo. We haven't talked about Milka Stylo for a while. It's so great. But I've given away so much of it. And, Evan has the same problem. Like when it's banging, it is like a quarter of your calcium and carbonate uptake. It's so dense and the branches grow so thick. It's a magical corals, and it feels so disrespectful to take this coral that's been in the hobby for so long, that it's been renamed a bunch of times. And, I still have plenty of good colonies, but it feels wrong somehow to throw it away. I know there's some older reefers that listen to this, and we'll put it in their calcium reactor. And that sounds cool. That sounds romantic. The only reason I don't subscribe to that is because if I put, I'm never going to have the same grade of corals to put in the calcium reactor, right? Sometimes it's going to be acros. Sometimes it's going to be Milka Stylo, which is really dense like Reborn. And sometimes, Euphilia polyps or like Bird's Nest or Digi. They're all going to dissolve at really different rates. And I don't want to end up with this mushy mush in my calcium reactor more than I have to. Yeah. So I'm like, I'm just going to stick with, the grades that I normally use, so I don't have to constantly be cleaning my calcium reactor or adjusting the flow rate through it.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, they're more complex than plants. And so, we assign or anthropomorphize things onto them. My wife always gets mad when I throw away a coral. She's like, "Oh, it's gonna die in the trash, and it's gonna, the poor creature." And I'm like, "Yeah, but it's like going into your garden. You got to prune, you got to hack off branches off a tree because that tree's shading this thing, and it's just part of gardening. We're gardeners, and part of gardening is that you're gonna have to take living organisms and hack them back, and yes, these are colonial animals, so you are killing an animal, and that feels a little bit awful.
You're killing a lot of animals,
right?
Every time you do a water change.
Well, that's true too, right? And I think it depends on what kind of, like you said, it depends on what corals we're talking about. I wouldn't throw one. If you can rehome these corals, cool. If you're in an area where your local fish store would love to have this inventory, or you're part of a club, whatever, but at a certain point for me, I'm just a very busy person. I've got my family. I don't want to sit around for hopefully some guy to show up with a 5-gallon bucket to take some corals off my hand when it's convenient for him, rather than it's Saturday morning, my kids are still asleep, I'm having a cup of coffee. You know what? I'm going to hack that coral back now because I have time to do it. Yeah, I don't. At the end of the day, we're gardeners, right? And yes, they're animals, and you feel bad killing off animals, especially colonial animals. I think, but if you want to achieve your aesthetic, if you want to achieve your goals, if you want to ensure the health of other corals in your tank, you have to go at it and prune things. And if you have the means or the resources to get rid of this stuff through your local fish store and rehome it, or your club, that's great. But sometimes with your life, you get busy. I get busy, and it's Sunday morning, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee, and the kids are still asleep, and I've got some free time to hack that coral back that's been bugging me, But then I don't want to have to try to figure out a time for somebody to show up with a 5-gallon bucket at my house either. And so, provided we're not talking about, solitary polyp LPS, if we're just talking branching hammers, if we're talking SPS, we're talking softies, just hack that stuff back and, put it in the compost pile or whatever.
Yeah, I think two great examples are bird's nest corals.
Yeah.
And echinopora, like plating echinopora, right? So when you go diving in the wild, bird's nest corals are never like larger than about a foot. I say that never. I'm sure you'll find one, but more often you'll see 10 of them that are about 5-6 inches long, kind of in a group, and you can tell that they're different colonies, slightly different species. So in a reef aquarium environment, pink bird's nest, super spiny, dense branching, grows close together, catches everything that flows through the tank, all of the sponge, Valonia, hair algae, and it's really hard to keep it growing really nice. And if you get it up to about 10 inches, it invariably starts dying at the bottom.
Yeah.
Right. So this is one of those times where you really have to be prepared to reset a coral like a pink bird's nest or a green bird's nest. I know a lot of bird's nest growers will feel me on this, but same thing with the plating kind of poras like the sprung stunner. Again, best case scenario, that thing grows huge and it starts, stinging something nearby or shading something underneath. And it's just something you really have to manage. And I don't think there's enough conversation about that as far as like grooming your corals for their own benefit, like the tree that you mentioned, as far as like cutting off branches. And that's something that I strive to do when I see kind of, a small branch that's growing well, but it's underneath its own branches and it's pointed in the wrong direction. I'm like, that's never going to be a great piece of the colony itself. If I cut off some of the bottom branches off my tree coral, it's going to get a lot more flow underneath, and it's probably going to benefit the animal as a whole.
Yeah, I agree.
And then good luck finding anyone who's going to jump at the opportunity to take your frags of, kind of platy, junky kind of pora. It's not exactly high on people's radar. Do you have any other thoughts on kind of some of the sacrifices we can make to better the reef?
I mean, so you come at it from a perspective of having essentially a coral farm, right? I mean, you're not in the business of selling corals, but you have a ton of real estate to grow coral.
I'm talking also about displays, though.
Yeah, no, but I guess what I mean is, in your case, you have the opportunity sometimes to say, okay, I'm going to take this coral out of this system and put it in that system. And when you and I think the one takeaway from this discussion is, even in your situation with as many systems as you have to practice restraint and you have to practice discipline, and you're editing your coral collection, right? When you're talking 1 or 2 tanks in your house, it's a matter of having that discipline, right? And in terms of, you mentioning, the being victims of your success, as your corals get bigger, sometimes you are going to remove just a giant colony, right? And then keep the colonies that you want. But it's just I guess the magic word of the day is just having discipline, restraint, and having being bold enough to get in there and make the necessary changes. That's the other thing, is like when you got a reef and it's just jamming and everything's growing, the last thing you want to do is go in there and be a disruptor. But man, you got to do it,
If you're looking at a thriving reef tank, and the corals are just filled in everything, you can always identify a few who are growing faster than the others, who are going to grow out of proportion with the scape. And sometimes, man, pruning is just not the answer. I find myself just removing the whole colony and putting a small, healthy piece back in. I did that, maybe about 6 months ago with the red dragon. I started by just thinking, I'm just going to trim some stuff out. But then I got into it. I'm like, this would be so much better if I just took everything out, put a good piece back in, and let it regrow. And yeah, now I can't even really tell that I've done some grooming, and I had a lot of extra red dragon left over that I gave away to a lot of people. I only have a couple extra colonies now. But yeah, I think there's some sacrifices to be made. That it's just a weird kind of non-linear conversation to have, to talk about, hey, you need to get rid of coral to make your reef tank better.
Yeah, I think we all can relate to just being bad at getting in there and doing it. It's not so much laziness sometimes. It's just like, I don't want to hack, but it does feel so good on the flip side, right? It usually does. When I got rid of that leather coral, for example, I felt like a weight off my shoulders, right?
Yep.
Because now all those compromises I had been making vaporized, right? In my 225, I had a Shades of Fall acro, which is a tabling acro. At least it was in my tank. And I kept hacking it back, hacking it back. But I mean, this thing, its goal was just like the leather coral to become a giant umbrella and shade everything below it, right? It's doing what it's competing as it was designed to do. And eventually I found, in that case, I did find somebody who was interested in it. I took the whole freaking colony out. I gave it to the guy. And it was like, I remember the next day just feeling so much better. I don't know how to put it. It's like, it's not that I'm that emotionally tied into my aquarium, but it's just, it's almost like I had a feeling about the tank that was nagging me and that I couldn't put my finger on it. But then when I made this indirect decision, I realized, oh, that nagging feeling was that damn coral. Like that coral got removed. I started to reshuffle some things, and then I was happy with the trajectory of the tank again. And so, yeah, there's just, I don't know. There's a nuanced thing to it where you just gotta sometimes feel it out, but it's always usually worth it in the end. Now, if you take too much out and all of a sudden your alk demand drops, but you're dosing too much and you nuke your tank with an alk spike, you'll probably be regretting it. There's definitely
Milka stylo, I think, is the biggest culprit in that department.
Yeah.
It's just so dense. But yeah, you're right. Did you sell the coral or did you give it away?
The Shades of Fall.
Mm-hmm.
I sold it for, I think, the price of a couple of frags of it. But I mean it was big.
Yeah. That's the other thing, man. I wish I'm on so many Facebook groups and I just see people every day trying to sell a few polyps of this and that for $5, $10, $20. I'm like, I know this hobby's expensive, but if we all just kind of, if it's rare Walt Disney or gold hammer or something fancy zoanthid, okay, sure, get your money's worth. But when it's just kind of an average coral that someone could have given you for free, just put it up there for free.
Yeah.
Just let somebody have it. I don't know that Reef stores would want to do this, but having like a free section where it's like leave a penny, take a penny, right?
Yeah.
That would be fun, and to have a section in the Reef shop where, all right, here's your sprunk stunner and some kind of junky whatevers. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a weird conversation to have, but I did want to ask you about some of the new Reef toys you got that you got from me on your visit. I know you've installed one of those things. Can you tell us about it?
Well, let me start at the beginning. So while I was hanging out with you in Colorado, my return pump on my main Reef died. It was a wiring issue. I won't get into the brand because I don't want to pick on brands, but I thank you to CJ for sending me out on a very accelerated. I don't know if they did overnight shipping or what, but those they sent me replacement pumps.
Were they there when you got back?
Yeah, they beat me home. I actually had to pay UPS to hold. You know how you can delay your delivery for $10 with UPS? I had to do that because I didn't want them sitting on the stoop in the rain because my neighbors were also out of town. So that happened, and then I came home and I was dealing with the cyano outbreak that I was just talking about earlier in the basement tank, and I felt something dripping on my head and realized that some of my house plumbing was leaking and the drywall was all damaged, and so that sucked. Then I ordered some stuff for my Reef tanks, and the FedEx truck that delivered it got stuck on my driveway, and the lady decided to try to burn out her tires to try to dislodge. And when you burn out tires, cheap tires, they plasticize and melt. So this weekend I've been scraping tar like goo because my kids and my dogs run through it and track it into my house. So that sucked on top of COVID. But yeah, you hooked me up with so beyond the CJ, thank you so much for that. But you hooked me up with some new Reef lights and a new skimmer for my basement tank to try out. One of them is the Ultra Reef. I don't know the model, like their smallest skimmer.
I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah, I'm always bad with model numbers.
It's the Bore, Borei, Bore UKB 120.
Okay. And it's funny because with the cyano, I decided just to nip it in the bud with some erythromycin or Chemiclean, and that'll always make your skimmer go nuts, right? But that skimmer is perfect for those situations because you can remove the inner what do you call it?
The riser cup.
The riser tube, right?
Yeah.
So I yank that out. So essentially, there's no cup to fill up, but there is a cup, right? And then I just set the DC powered pump down to like the lowest setting, and so it just aerated the tank without overflowing, and did a chemical treatment. And the thing is dead silent, which is nice. Yeah, I mean that thing is now I got it skimming normally, and it's pretty consistent. So, and then I did swap out the AI lights I had with the Reef Lab Unos. And those are pretty cool. I definitely like the fact that there's no glare, especially because where I sit to enjoy that tank, or it's also where my kid plays with his Hot Wheels, looking up at the tank down in the basement. So they're pretty cool. They're definitely I would say not as intuitive or user friendly. Like it's like you got to be comfortable setting IP addresses and you know it's not just like a Bluetooth connection, right? Like you have to connect. They have their own access points, almost like connecting to a Wi-Fi access point, but the access point is a light. Then you tell it what your Wi-Fi is, and then you know your Wi-Fi gives it an IP address. And then it gets kind of tricky because like in my system or in my network, I can permanently assign IP addresses for certain reserved situations, right? I would definitely recommend doing that with these lights because your router might reboot and reassign a new IP address. It's always displayed. It's got a little display, which is really cool, so you always know what the IP is to log into, I guess. But anyway, they're interesting. Let's see how they pan out over some time, but they've got really good spread and they've got no shading, so that's kind of nice. And they're quiet. That's kind of nice too. So
cool.
I'm excited
Very
to try
cool.
those out.
But I know everybody knows about the Hydras and the Kessels and the Radeon, so it's nice to shine a light on a smaller manufacturer like Refi. They just announced their Uno 2.0.
Saw that, yeah.
Yeah, so but I think you're going to have enough power for the LPS Lagoon that you're aiming for.
Oh, I had to turn them down massively because I'm only running about 80, 90 par for these LPS.
80, 90 micromoles?
Sorry, micromoles, yeah. So swapping out the AIs, I first did a measurement with my par meter and then, threw these on and I was like, ooh, we got to turn all the dials way down. So I'm not using them to their full intensity potential, but that goes sort of back to what you said in a previous podcast about, we get these crazy intense lights and then we turn them down because we only need
all the way.
Yeah.
All the way. Yeah, the new version has more and more power. And, lately I've been lamenting the fact that there's not like a Radeon XR7, something like passively cooled about the size of an XR15, or I don't know if Kessel still makes their 50-watt model or if they just keep selling the old versions because they have a 15-watt version and then go straight up to 90 watts. And I'm like, yeah, I think more than ever we need some lower powered lights, especially being considerate of the costs associated with these devices nowadays.
Not only that, but the benefit of the form factor changes, right? If you build a light that peaks out at, let's say, 250 micromoles of par on an even spread, can you get away with no fan or a fan that barely turns on? Can you go to a thinner form factor that folks that use a canopy can use more easily? I don't know. It's like we got these high horsepower lights and not all of us are SPS nuts either,
I have one tank where I'm running Radeon Gen 4 Pros at full power over Acros, and it's the only one. Everything else, if I dialed them up a lot, they would totally just bleach a lot of stuff.
Oh, that was what I was going to mention. Some of the takeaways from visiting your studio. One was, and you just did a YouTube video on it. You had the Chalice Palace and that whole mode system, but the displays in there, despite having very low intensity lighting, I mean, the minute I walked up, I was like, I could have any of those displays in that mode system in my house, and I'd be happy with that. And then the other takeaway I had was, and this is more relevant to the video you just released about that row of tanks, is I remember thinking, size doesn't really matter. I mean, we always want bigger, bigger, bigger tanks. And again, you have the ability to have so many systems that you always have room to put stuff. So maybe it's easier for you to really max the potential of a smaller tank without having to exercise as much restraint as, say, if somebody only had a 3-foot tank in their house. But I sat in front of some of those innovative marine tanks and thought, man, these are amazing displays with mature colonies, and they feel bigger than they are when I sat in front of them. So anyway, that's something I was going to share with you, I guess more in person, but since we're talking, I brought it up now.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me on this makeup session of Reef Therapy. I just want to remind everyone that if you're in Australia or the whereabouts, we're going to have Reef Stock Australia the first weekend of August. And, some part of the Reef Builders team is going to be out there. Go to reefstock.show for more information. Also, I don't do this every time, but make sure to rate us, Reef Therapy, on your favorite podcatcher. And we love the community that we've cultivated around Reef Therapy in the YouTube comments. There's a lot of great conversations there. I think it's the kind of conversations that you and I hope to have more often in the general online world and in real life. So, we really appreciate the comments you guys put up there. So, make sure to keep doing that. Mark, I hope you feel better soon.
Thanks,
and I'll see you for another session in just a few days.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right. See you, man.